All right, I know everyone's very busy, so we're going to go ahead and get started. We have a great panel here with, I did a little bit of quick math, well over a century of ed tech experience, ready to talk about what's been going on in schools in the last couple of months, what everyone should be thinking about for the summer, how we can all be prepared for a new normal and a fall 2020 back to school season. Let's start off with some introductions of our panel. Start with you, Pete.
I am Pete Just. I am the Chief Technology Officer for the MSD of Wayne Township, which is Indianapolis, and I am the current CoSN Board Chair.
Thank you. Tina?
Tina Barrios with Polk County Public Schools in Florida near Orlando, and I'm the Assistant Superintendent of Information Systems and Technology.
Great, thank you. How about you, Keith?
Hi, Amy. Keith Krueger, CEO of CoSN, the Consortium for School Networking, and we're a national nonprofit that represents district technology leaders like Pete and Tina, and we appreciate being asked to be on today's call.
We appreciate you being here. How about you, Brian? You're muted.
I am muted. Brian Thomas, CEO of Lightspeed Systems. Thank you.
It's like we planned that just to mirror what you all are experiencing in your remote learning situations every day. Chad?
Exactly.
Yeah, hey everybody. I'm Chad Stevens. I'm a leader for K12 education at Amazon Web Services, former CTO, and also a member of the CoSN board.
Thank you. And I'm Amy Bennett. I'm the Vice President of Marketing at Lightspeed Systems. Going to be moderating this discussion that we've got it split up into a couple of parts, but I'm sure it will go where these people take it and where your questions take it. So feel free to ask questions as we go. You can enter those in the question box in your GoToWebinar panel, and we'll do some throughout and we'll do some at the end. First of all, as we all know, really an unprecedented, overused word, but it's true, challenge was put to everyone and especially to schools a couple of months ago. I want to hear a little bit about how your district responded, what worked and what didn't, and what your remote learning plans really look like. Let's start with you, Tina.
So when this whole thing started, there was honestly a little bit of panic on my part because I know how hard it was going to be to try to do sort of one-to-one period and distance learning. And so the first thing we did was to try to identify what the actual need was. And we still really don't have a good handle on that, to be honest. We know that there's a large percentage, we have a large rural area, and so we knew that we had some areas of deficiency for students being able to learn at home. And we were actually, the Friday before they actually shut us down, had a questionnaire that we were planning to send out that following Monday. So we ended up having to put that questionnaire online. We got about 37,000 or so responses. We're a little over 100,000 students, so about a third responded. One of the questions that we were a little, I guess maybe not so much baffled by, but one of the questions we asked is, do you have a smartphone at home with unlimited data? And only about 56% had unlimited data. So I think there were a lot of perceptions out there that, well, all these kids have phones and they're going to be able to connect. We also tried to look at numbers in terms of our student portal accounts. And again, we had just under about a third of really active accounts. And so that was the best data that we had. As we started rolling out and getting prepared to send devices out, we ended up sending about 23,000 devices home with students. I will say that one of the deficiencies that we had was that we had not had a lot of licensing to send devices home for filtering. We were currently using Fortinet, and we had actually been piloting in a handful of schools Lightspeed. And so when this hit us, we did not have a solution. And so I'm very thankful for Lightspeed, because they literally came on board, said, we'll set you up, no charge, let's just get this going. And it was a huge lifesaver for us because that was a huge deficiency. We were not sending a lot of devices home, so we didn't have a solution. That was immensely helpful to us. And then at the time, we had no real way to look at access at home. And so initially, we just sent out information about what providers were offering free broadband and things like that. And over time, what we immediately did, but took us some time, was we ordered 50 bus MiFi, cellular MiFis. Cradlepoint is what we ended up using. And we ordered those. It took us a little bit of time to get those in. We ended up ordering 500 MiFis, and we purchased outright just because of the pricing structure. But again, it wasn't something we could just turn over in 4 or 5 days. It was, you know, weeks out. So it took us some time to get that rolling. And the other piece is we did sort of a blended, K5 was sort of a blended way of learning. We did learning packets that we sent home. We fed kids. So one of the ways that we had is we already had a process at a lot of sites for feeding kids, because that was, for our superintendent, there were really 2 major criteria that she was adamant about. And that was, one, feeding every kid that needed it and giving every kid a device. So that was our marching orders, and that's really kind of what we worked toward to put the plan in place. The deficiency that we had is that we didn't have a unified learning management system. We do use Office 365. Teams kicked in pretty heavily. We also support and use Google Classroom, and we do have a single sign-on, but we didn't say as a district, everybody's going to use this platform. So there's goods and bads about that. There are multiple platforms, gives you an opportunity when one fails, like we had an issue, actually had an issue with Lightspeed in our iPads when we first deployed. Google Classroom made a change, and it caused some problems with those that we took home. It was quickly resolved, but it was a lot of work for a couple of days to get that done. But that's really the reality. You know, when you're using these systems and updates happen, sometimes things break, and that was our reality. So we worked through. We also had some issues with teams that we're still working through. So, you know, when you massively do this, it's not just a district effect. It's really uniformly affected across our country.
Yeah, it's an interesting balance, I think, between wanting some consistency because it makes it a little easier to manage, easier for parents and students and everyone to use, but wanting to have some personalization to the audience, which LMS or systems or tools are right for elementary, high school, whatever those different things are. So it seems like you're working through some of those balances there. I'm glad we could help you out with the filtering and student safety, though. How about you, Pete? What about Wayne Township?
Well, we were a little early to the game, at least in Indiana, because the very first incidents of anyone in the school getting COVID-19 was the school district right next to us, Avon Community Schools. And so we have a number of teachers whose students go there. There's a lot of back and forth because, you know, it's just a street that separates us. And so on, it was March 13th, we closed our schools. We had worked through things over the prior week. And it was a significant disruptor. Obviously, we couldn't have been ready for this, as everyone's kind of realized, although we were in a pretty good place to be ready, but we could never have anticipated this. So for us, we've been one-to-one since 2019, from 3rd grade to 12th grade, with some exceptions for BYOD. We've been doing BYOD for 12 years. We had the first online school in 1999. So we've been doing online learning for so long. We had the devices for, out of our 17,000 students, at least 12,000 of them. But we weren't ready for this type of an environment. Some of those devices were kept in classrooms, assigned to students, but only used during the day. Well, you know, we couldn't get those ready in time in such a quick turnaround for them to go home. So we had to do distributions of those, things like that. And we'd kind of gone through the whole argument and thinking of like, all right, well, what's a class day look like? What's seat time? Because we'd done these virtual school options for a while. But, you know, again, we have a lot of staff that are highly trained in blended and virtual learning, but not 1,200 staff, which is what we have. we probably have 150 to 200 that are highly trained and engaged in it all the time. So we had to scale that. So a lot of professional development to accomplish the remote learning. And we recognized that this was a compromised version of what we could do because we had something really good to compare it against. But we felt like we were in a good place to be able to get those devices out to students, to be able to ramp up the teachers in kind of the 3 days that we had as a run up, and then provide some options. Now, what we saw was that a lot of synchronous learning was still being attempted. There was a huge adoption of Zoom. In our district, like there were in a lot of districts. We're a Google district, so we were urging Meet. But it was interesting because a lot of even district leaders kind of thought as this type of instruction as having to be very synchronous and trying to replicate what's happening in the classroom and not really paying attention to maybe the better option of having a blend of synchronous and asynchronous options. So for us, thankfully we had a lot of things in place that were already really solid and good. We had a lot of standards. We've been an interoperability focused district for a long time. So our learning management system had a lot of content in it. It had our curriculum in it. Every teacher had been in it at least once. And so it was not that unfamiliar. We had a single sign-on solution. We had, a single communication platform for all of our parents. We had a lot of devices going home, so we were using Relay and it really effectively tuned that to work particularly well to kind of simulate the filtering environment that we had in the school district. So we were able to scale up pretty well. We kind of have a pretty good environment for coordinated decision making across the district, from cabinet level folks all the way down to the team that I have who does a lot of implementation. So this forced everyone to innovate. It forced every single educator for the first time ever from pre-K to 12th grade to think differently. And so I think that's a very big positive. They didn't have a choice and they had to scale up as fast as they could. So innovation is blooming, which I think is great, but boy, we still have a lot of problems to solve in terms of equity and in terms of improving instruction, and that's something we're going to be tackling this summer.
You bring up so many interesting points. I've been doing a lot of interviews with school districts and trying to figure out some of the keys that don't make this smooth, but maybe are some of the stepping stones that make it a little bit easier. Having enough devices, having them at least going home some of the time, so you have filtering and other systems in place that work from anywhere. But one of the keys that has really come to the forefront here, and you both talked about it, is access and equity and things that I know, Keith, you've been yelling about for years, and now everyone is talking about the digital divide. What are you guys doing from CoSN, and what are you seeing?
Yeah, and I think it's a great question, and congratulations to Tina and Pete, who've been on the forefront for many years and kinds of leading this. And I think every kind of ed tech leader has had to, every teacher, every student has had to see this the last 8 weeks as really a pivot. And that said, I think this issue of equity and the lack of access is certainly something that a lot of us have been talking about for a long time. This is just, a loud screeching siren that we now perhaps have the attention of policymakers and parents about why this is so important. I also think it's easy to lose sight of the progress that we've made, that this was a really big, it's a big shift, but we had made tremendous progress on broadband at school. We do a national survey, and really every school, basically every classroom in the country had reached kind of the short-term goals, and about a third of them had reached the longer-term, higher speed broadband goals that the FCC had laid out. We were also making progress on devices. In fact, over half of the schools' chief technology officers reported that they had one-to-one environments, and it was much higher, of course, at middle and particularly high school. So places like Wayne Township and Tina's district, we're better placed than ever before for this. However, the pandemic was something completely new, and that was the lens of home access. That has not been covered by our E-rate program historically. And so suddenly, overnight, with a snap of a finger, school districts were expected to go to remote learning. And I think everyone who's made this leap should be thought of as a hero. That doesn't necessarily mean we're doing best practice yet of how to do it. So we've got a lot of improvement to go. I think that we certainly here at CoSN are working to help policymakers, in Congress understand why it's so important that we make sure that we don't leave behind the 11 million children that don't have access. And that's in about 8 million families that have children. And I think Tina was right on point that even, too often we've made assumptions that simply because that you do have a device, that you do have internet access. Well, if that device is a smartphone, can you really use that for online learning? If you can do it for some things, but not all things. And if you're data capped, can you really do these online classes? And what's the burden that we're putting on parents and guardians in terms of the expectations, and what really works for accessibility. There are kids obviously with very special needs, so how are they going to be accommodated? And really, accessibility is a much broader issue than just those with a legal definition of accessibility. We ought to be baking in accessibility. And I heard Pete mentioning some of those key things like universal design and interoperability that ought to be built into the network from the get-go. And finally, what works for older kids probably doesn't work for the youngest kids. So what does that look like in terms of our learning management systems and the expectations? And so that was a kind of long-winded answer, but hopefully we'll get a chance to have more conversation about some of these things.
Yeah, and I definitely want to dig into some of the things that you hit on from the different age groups, and I think that ties to the synchronous versus asynchronous learning, as well as the choices of systems like LMSs and all of those things. I think one of the really interesting things that has happened, everyone on this panel talking about access and the homework gap and the digital divide and all of those things. It has been hard for kind of the general public to understand, but now they're seeing and feeling it in a way that I think is really interesting. When a student can't go to the library or isn't at school to go to that library or go to a public library to do research, if they don't have connectivity, how can they look anything up and do research? Schools that are sending home packets, the logistics behind that is one thing, right? You're printing packets, you're putting them in the mail, students are filling them out, you're calling on the phone to check in, receiving them back. So it's a lot to deal with for logistics. And Tina, you're nodding. I want to hear your thoughts on this, but also how engaging is it? How helpful is that? Tina, do you want to comment on that?
Yeah, so I think I was chuckling because the interesting thing was when, we decided that initially it was going to be K5 and we were going to send packets home, and just the logistics of printing and packaging and distributing, right? Which the funny thing is that's old technology. And so what when we first embarked on this and they were looking at me like, okay, so what are we going to do? I said, well, you're asking me, we're struggling to do old technology, and now we're flipping and you're asking me to do all of this digitally sort of overnight. And I tried to make that comparison of just how hard just the paper packaging was, which is something we know. And so, just for people that don't understand the difficulty about technology and making everything seem seamless, those of us that live in this world know that, you know, we don't get a lot of pat on the back. People just expect it to work, and when it doesn't work, you know, that's what we hear most of all, as opposed to the positives. You know, and as Keith said, we've made huge progress, but there are challenges. And just on a personal level, so my daughter's a first grade teacher in Manatee County. I actually still live in Manatee, and she has a kindergartner and a 3-year-old. And so she was essentially thrown into this first grade. And the funny thing was that the first week it was a little bit of emotional upheaval trying to get there. But she was trained, they use Schoology, and she was trained on the LMS a couple years ago. And her comment was, well, I didn't pay much attention because I was never going to use this for my first graders. And then all of a sudden they were thrown in. And so, you know, Keith mentions grade level, you know, so she's teaching first grade, trying to at least part of the day, 15-20 minutes, do read aloud. And you know, the other thing about these younger kids, you know, from a personal perspective, is they really desire to be together. So they're struggling not seeing their friends. And so, you know, trying to at least do some experience virtually, even if it's FaceTime with their buddies, which my daughter does a little bit of. And then, so she's doing first grade, and she's trying to do a kindergartner online. And just simple things like when you log in and log out, you have to clear the cache and whatnot, because you know, there are just those little idiosyncrasies about LMSs. And then she's got a 3-year-old in the background running around, you know, trying to manage his virtual learning time frame and what she's doing with their kids. So it, you know, it really touches, like you said, even in education, it hits teachers. But outside of that now, parents, and I think we're hearing all over the country, parents are really beginning to understand what teachers really do day in and day out, and the value. I think there's, you know, on a positive note, you know, from challenges, we have opportunities. And I think the opportunity for us to really celebrate what teachers do every day in and out, and the difficulty of managing all of that. And, you know, when we talk about this shift, we're really talking about a second order change now. We've been doing incremental, as Keith said, we've been a long time in this world, and we've made some really great incremental progress, not only with devices and the pricing coming down where it's really truly affordable, but great online resources with Web 2.0 and all of the different resources we had that we didn't have 15, 20 years ago, as robust and more user friendly. So I think those are positives, and I think that has helped us make the transition. But it's the people side, right? And there's some things, you know, that we really need to pay attention to with the people side. And I will say that, you know, we use Gaggle as our monitoring system. We've seen an uptick in our middle and high schools on incidents from an emotional mental health perspective that we're catching. Luckily, we have that system in place, and we can address those, but we're seeing an uptick in that. So there's certainly some things on the mental health side that as educators we need to focus on as well.
Yeah, that's a really important point, and I've been reading so much about it. You know, we closed all the school buildings, have students learning from home to protect them from the virus, but it brings up a lot of other safety issues and mental well-being issues. Brian, talk a little bit about what Lightspeed's doing just to help schools through this, to help protect students. Well, he's frozen.
Rebooted.
I can.
Let's do Chad instead. So one of the things that has come up through all of our speakers, Chad, is, you know, the logistics of shifting to digital and what's involved in having systems that work on or off a school network, whatever that looks like. How is AWS helping schools through some of this?
Yeah, hopefully we get Brian back soon. Yeah, so on the logistics point, you know, we've helped, you know, tens of thousands of students just get devices, which is something that we've never experienced before. In LAUSD, we were using our delivery networks to deliver, you know, Chromebooks to students' homes, which is something new for us as we try to help. I think, and then on the mental health, since you were heading there, you know, we've also seen things like in LA spinning up very rapidly contact centers for like a mental health hotline, so that students, teachers can get to those mental health resources. I mean, they have 700,000 students. Tina pointed out, you know, these are big districts that need need things really fast. So the power of the cloud means that, you know, really over a weekend, we can stand up a massive contact center like that really allows people to work, you know, from home. Hey, Brian, he's back. So, you know, and then on the other front, you know, I think our initial focus was really helping our ed tech partners. So like on this call, like one, Lightspeed, you know, I think a lot of people don't always realize, you know, that many of these ed techs are powered by AWS. So helping a school at G-Scale, as somebody mentioned, helping folks like Remind or Canvas, a lot of connectivity solutions, those are all powered by AWS. So our initial focus was really, what can we do immediately to help schools? We knew that there was probably some customer need, but they were the closest. Our partner network was the closest. And so that's where we kind of put our resources first. And then we've kind of made a shift toward really remote learning and work support, right? So schools, you know, when I was a CTO, people didn't work from home very often. And so helping schools get those remote tools, whether it's like a remote workspace, out to their users so they can do a VPN backend and get to the tools that they need to. But we've also seen from an equity standpoint, a real big shift in application streaming. So we have tools that were traditionally bound to a computer lab, you know, engineering courses, Project Lead the Way, Adobe for art, you know, AutoCAD, you name it, that kids weren't getting to. And so we've used application streaming services to really get there. And then, you know, last but not least, teachers. You know, I was a teacher, a principal. And a lot of you have talked about it. Pete and Tina both talked about it. Like making the shift as a teacher to remote learning. We really work to mobilize our teacher network. We have AWS Educate, so they're ongoing, having global webinars, global office hours that teachers can just dial into and say, I need help with X. And so we're kind of putting our global teacher network, all that's free. So that's really, you know, where we've been focused first, is just, you know, on that kind of immediate customer need. You know, moving forward, we're really starting to think about, you know, what does a resilient school district look like? How can this be easier for schools? You know, if God forbid this happens again, that schools can feel less pain, and that's really kind of going to be our next focus as we go into the CoSN conference next week. That's what we'll be talking about. So
the virtual CoSN
that's where we've been. Yeah, the virtual CoSN conference. So that's what we'll be talking about is really how do you get there. So yeah. I'll hand it back over to you and let Brian. Looks like Brian's back.
Yeah, let's see if Brian can respond to a little bit of how Lightspeed ties into what we've been hearing about student safety and cloud systems and partnerships with school districts.
Yeah, sorry about the difficulties there. So look, the first thing I was going to point out was kind of addressed, but it is that we're just extremely impressed with our employees and being able to work from home and having really good attitudes about the mission and vision of Lightspeed. And of course, almost everyone we work with has a great attitude, is trying to solve the problem. Everybody seems to be remaining calm. And, you know, our customers, school districts are really our partners, and they're under a much more challenging situation than a software company who can kind of work virtually and doesn't have students. I'm watching my own children interact with their teachers and the attitudes of everybody. I think it's been a really, really positive and impressive thing. I've seen very little drama, but we are hearing from our customers and from the data we collect and the interactions that we have that there is a very disconcerting theme around the mental health of kids and teachers and everyone else. And while it seems really pleasant at my house and probably most of your houses, there's lots of places where it isn't that pleasant, where we're focusing more on the fundamentals. We're not talking about adaptive learning or personalized learning or how to maximize the use of our LMS with most of our customers at this point. We're talking about, is the device connected? Is it safe? And is a student safe, mentally and physically safe? And, you know, I'm talking to school districts who are trying to deliver food to students who went to school for food. or customers who have put Wi-Fi on buses and drove them into neighborhoods so they could get kids connected. And so, look, my perspective and how I think Lightspeed's going to be running our roadmap and our business for the next 6 months or longer is around the fundamental basics: equity, safety. Is the student mentally and physically safe, and are they connected to a device initially? And then the next theme, which is kind of leapfrogged a lot of the advanced R&D and work we were doing, is data. Meaning, what we're hearing from our customers is, I just need to know physically where the device is. That's a pretty good indicator that I know where the student is, and how that device is being used and which applications are being used. You talk about Zoom. You know, we went from everyone in the world install Zoom to everyone in the world uninstall Zoom. If you think about school districts, and we work across the world, trying to help, you know, Tina's daughter, the teacher who is installing Zoom for the first time and now being asked to install Teams, and the IT department, curriculum department might want to know who's actually made the shift from Zoom to Teams, or from Teams to Zoom. We are really concerned with which vendor they use, but there's so much that could be done around professional development, visibility, making sure that they can see what's being used and by who, and that where's my device, where's my student, are they safe, and how is this thing being used, and I can help educate and do more professional development and just open the visibility into, because it didn't really matter before. It wasn't nearly as important that a mobile device, that you knew exactly where and how a mobile device was being used, because it came back to your network every day. Now it doesn't go back to your network every day, so that's been kind of where we're spending a lot of our time.
Let's use that as a little bit of a transition to where we've been in the last 2 months to what schools can do over the summer to be ready for the fall, starting with a little bit what the fall could look like. I mean, none of us has the crystal ball into the future, but we've all been reading the reports and reading the news, and you know, it's everything from being prepared to school opening late, not opening on time, to opening but with staggered, remote, and on campus, or half the students 1 week or 1 day, or periods where it's closed and you're remote learning, you know, all kinds of mixes to allow for social distancing and flattening the curve and all these phrases that now are just part of our normal vocabulary. So thinking about how we get from today in May to school starting in August, taking some of the lessons that we've learned to use the summer project time to really get ready for what back to school looks like. What is that looking like for you, Pete? You're nodding.
Well, I think the one thing we can assume is it won't look like 1999 or 2019. They weren't much different. What we know now is that it's going to be very different. We can plan, but we need to plan for the worst, hope for the best, and decide as late as possible, I think, is kind of what we've learned through this. You don't want to decide today what the fall is going to look like, because there's so many variables that are going to change between now and then. So you really have to take into account all of the options, to your point, Amy. And for us, what we've done is we've created 7 committees. All of our administrators and key decision makers and key thinkers are on these committees. They're working right now through the month of May, giving us as a cabinet a report at the beginning of June on what's our pandemic response going to look like next year, what's mental health and wellness going to look like next year, what's return instruction looks like. We've got a post-secondary pathways committee for what's it look like when you get beyond our school district, you know, because a lot of students are talking gap years and things like that now, which in districts of high poverty are often not productive. Gap years are not. We've got a facilities committee, a school operations committee, a technology committee. Those 7 are looking at how do we start with 3 different scenarios, right? In-person instruction with and without social distancing, hybrid, in-person, remote learning, as you kind of go back and forth between them. And then what does fully remote instruction look like? You know, by the way, teachers, you got to get ready for all that. The good news is we've got 3 months. We just had 3 days for this. The bad news is we only have 3 months, and of those, most are not contract days for teachers. So, you know, how do we scale up for that? Quite honestly, teachers are going to have to kind of volunteer to kind of rejigger everything and retool, much like factories have to, you know, in the olden days, if you will, in terms of your production line has to go away. You got to bring in all new production line and then, you know, build that around what people need today. So what students and families need today, they've experienced something in the last 2 months that some of them hate, some of them love, and everyone's kind of someplace in between, right? To Brian's point, some of those family situations, they aren't loving having the kids home all the time. You know, we feed students breakfast, lunch, and dinner. When we're not in session, we still are feeding them breakfast and lunch. But where's dinner come from? These are real problems of equity and concern that we have to think about for next year. So for us, we've taken the approach, and honestly, there's something called a return to school roadmap that I would highly encourage people to look at. The return to school roadmap is kind of what we've based our discussions off of right now. These committees are all in full force, meeting a couple of times a week, giving us weekly updates with an idea of an initial, you know, plan put together by June 1st. So I think if you're a district and you're kind of wondering what to do, that's a good place to start, is to think about what will you do in all of these areas. And you know, you've got specialists in all of them, like distribute the work. You don't have to do it as a superintendent. You don't have to do it as a CTO. Distribute the work and have people bring recommendations back to you. I think that's the key for what we should be doing as we get into the summer and through it.
Well, and I think you really hit on the fact so many of the questions that came in and continue to come in are about how do you prepare for something that you have no idea what it looks like? And the answer is something like prepare for something you have no idea what it looks like. Prepare for the worst, prepare for a mix. You know, there are certain systems, I'd throw Relay into this, but there are certain systems that whether schools are at home or on campus, either way, it's just going to work. Like, where can you build that in? How can you prepare teachers for a little bit of both, a little bit of either? So what's the summer list look like in Polk to get all of you guys ready, Tina?
So one of the things that we're looking at is that we didn't have, was sort of a deficiency, was a standard learning management system. And so we're very quickly looking at that, because one of the things, while I think it's great to have the flexibility, one of the challenges we've heard even from our own staff that have kids is I get in and I go to this link in Google Classroom and it's this math lesson and I can't find it, right? And so they're going all over the place. And so we know that that's a deficiency. So we're actually very actively looking at implementing that to streamline. I mean, we're lucky, like Pete, that we have you know, an infrastructure in place. We do have lots of devices. We have a single sign-on. There's not a shortage really of digital resources. And one of the things I would say going forward is, one, look at what you already know, but two, really begin to streamline some things instead of having 100 different resources. Really decide these are the key resources that we're going to start with in the fall and focus on some key things that you know are going to make an impact, because you can't do it all. And so for teachers' sake, I think really kind of streamlining and saying these are critical resources that we know for English language learners or for young readers. And Pete talked about the gap. We're looking at what are we doing this summer, because we're going to try to do some continued learning this summer with kids that we know are kind of on that bubble, and we know we're going to have to catch up. So it's looking at what do we need to do to catch up for those that are already behind, and then those, you know, where are kids coming in to start. And for us, there's a little bit of a challenge, because we're just now getting ready to start hurricane season. And so we're actually already having conversations with the EOC on a weekly basis on what are we going to do if we have a storm, because all of our core of our schools become shelters. What does that look like? And so on top of, you know, what does it look like in the fall with these challenges, we also have to consider what's the storm season going to be for us. So those are some of the challenges that we're working on right now.
It's back to be ready for anything, right? You know, and And one of the things that I've heard is that areas where they've been through storms and hurricanes and closures and snow, all of those things that have led to some extended closures, they've hit on some of these touchstones and addressed some of these things leading up to this.
Yeah, one of the things we found is we're looking across the country about like who has some good models for this. And guess what? Montana. They have so many school closures and they are so separated from one another that the Montana School Boards Association put together a really great document. I'd encourage you to look at it in terms of how do you do, you know, sudden closures and continue with the learning.
Yeah, that's a great point. And you know, one of the reasons we pulled this event together, and one of the reasons I love working in K12 is that everyone's willing to help each other out, right? So there are lessons to be learned from Montana. There are lessons to be learned from storms in Florida and snow elsewhere. And pulling those all together can just help everyone be a little bit more prepared, right? So Keith, what should schools be thinking about between now and back to school from your perspective, whether, you know, whether it's about access to rural communities or to homes or something else?
Yeah, and just to key off of what Tina was just talking about, you know, I think we had developed a lot of resources around IT crisis preparedness, but it was, you know, about hurricanes, floods, fires, natural disasters, never through the lens of a health pandemic. So we will be releasing an updated resource very shortly, because, you know, it's likely that you will have, you know, maybe 24 hours, maybe 30, maybe 72 hours or something, that when you see that you're going to have to go again remote. So we will be doing that. And we put out some other resources on video conferencing and on privacy in this time of remote learning. But I think this is another pivot moment for people who have, maybe for everyone at the school district level, but particularly for those that have technology in their title. And that is, you know, you've got to somehow hopefully move out of the muck of the moment and into being the strategic leader on innovation. And that, I think, you know, we've heard a lot of the logistics around, you know, if we move to a partial reopening or you know, using social distancing, well, what does that blended learning look like, and how does it fit in, and how does it change the economics of what schools are trying to do? I was listening to one school district in New Mexico that it's a large district, but if they were to do the social distancing for their regular daily routes with buses, they would need more than every bus that exists currently with all the school districts of New Mexico. So it's not realistic, some of the assumptions that some administrators or parents or policymakers might have. And it's time for this audience of ed tech leaders to put on their innovation hat and say there's new and better ways to do this. And that's what we have to come with, that lens, I think. And so, you know, it's really your moment to shine, not just to automate the things that we were already doing, but what are new ways of doing it.
So take a question like, how can I arrange my desks in a classroom? And instead ask, do I need desks in a classroom and when?
And
why?
I know students have to come to school. Why do they have to be together? When do they have to be together? What is it? How do we use technology that brings people in, that supports their mental well-being, as opposed to being a distraction or make things worse?
Yeah.
Right. I'd add to that. That's an excellent point, is like, what's the purpose? You know, we've been all kind of talking the last couple of years of what's the why? Like, why do we gather? Well, there's a purpose to gather. I love to have people over for dinner. We've got a nice big deck. I love to have people come around and sit around the fireplace. There's a benefit in that, right? But there are some times when you know, getting together in a school building is wasteful, right? And I think parents are seeing that, and that is what's thrusting us into the there might be a lot more hybrid and totally remote options chosen by parents than if we don't provide, someone else will. So we have to address the real baseline concerns that parents are now developing in terms of like, why do we send our kids to school for 8 hours? For
And
some of them,
facility,
there's a good reason.
you know, you think
Like,
of
why do I go to work for 8 hours? Why were we all doing the exact same thing every day, right?
I'm working more hours now than ever before.
start 8 in the morning and end at 3? You know, especially with high school kids or older kids, they don't even wake up till 11. I mean, the science is pretty clear. So yeah, I'm not saying that kids need to do more than whatever, 6 or 7 hours of time, but is there a magic thing that everything has to stop at 3 p.m.? If we extended that, then suddenly I know that there was a school in Albuquerque a few years ago it was kids that had dropped out. Well, they're working. They, you know, for whatever reasons, maybe they had a problem, maybe they had a pregnancy or whatever, but they have to work now. So the school actually stays open till 10 p.m. and they allow teachers and students to pick what are the 6 hours or 7 hours that they're going to do learning. And some teachers want to do 7 in the morning until noon or 2 or 3, but others want to start at noon or 2 in the afternoon. Why do we have to be so regimented?
It really ties into the synchronous versus asynchronous, Pete, that you were talking about, right?
That's the disruption. And I think, you know, just to throw it to you, Chad, for a second, because I think Amazon has kind of represented this in the retail space, right? I mean, I don't know about where you live, but where we live, we got malls that are closing all their anchors. Why? Because people are shopping on Amazon or some other online service. The big conversations are like, where do the packages get dropped off at your house? And can you pull up and they'll put it in your trunk? It's totally changed these conversations, and that's what's happening to education right now. So I know, Chad, you guys have a lot of experience with that.
Annie is the world.
I think, I mean, I think, you know, listen to this conversation, like I always think of this as, how do I minimize risk to learning continuity? But the learning continuity and where the learning happens and when it happens and where it happens is all changed, right? So we really believe that, you know, at AWS, you know, in the fullness of time, most K12 systems are going to leverage cloud in a really meaningful way. But this is a time where, you know, when I think about it, you know, this is a tried and true technology that's been around for 20 years that companies like Lightspeed use every day to deliver to schools. That's still very disruptive, but there's a worn path to move into this new model. And there's a reason why other entities around the globe, you know, use these type of models. So, you know, I really think about it as a former CTO, I think a lot of folks think about this shift as just so big. It's very big. It's kind of scary. But I think about it in really two questions. I've tried to frame this up for schools is, you know, can teachers adequately educate their students in a remote setting? Can administrators operate their departments and schools in a remote setting? And how fast can you move to that remote setting? Those are three simple kind of questions as I've thought about it with my CTO lens on. And I think leaders need to take bite-sized chunks, right? There's short sprints, medium sprints, and long sprints. So for Tina, talked about her pretty short sprint, right, to get an LMS. There's ways to do that relatively quickly. And a lot of you have talked about scale and speed. And, you know, that's something that we really pride ourselves on, is how to move fast at scale. When we think about some of the things we've done, it's had to be very fast. And, you know, for many years, probably some people on this webinar have seen me present before. I always present this slide that says schools can't afford to be slow. And people kind of go, yeah, schools can't afford to be slow. Well, when COVID happened, that's when we really couldn't afford to be slow, and we had to have these solutions. So we feel like, you know, we have the ability to free some schools up and free our ed tech partners like Lightspeed up to move faster. So that's kind of how I would answer that. Thanks,
so Brian, you talked about data and analytics as you're kind of back to the foundations or reporting on this. You have students learning at night. at home early in the morning, different times, different places, different devices, to what Chad and Tina were talking about, quickly scaling up systems like an LMS. What does reporting look like to know if any of this is working, if students are really logging in, if you're not taking attendance on a Zoom? How does that work?
Right, and by the way, that has come up a few times, and I will also give a little credit to Amazon. AWS has been working with us. What we decided to do, and I've been through this before over the last 21 years with natural disasters in states or areas, never the entire world all at the same time. But we were able to say to our customers or prospects, at no charge to you at all, you can run our software. And Amazon has been able to give us breaks in our pricing because we have costs and they have costs, and basically said, if we can get you ramped up as fast as possible and not charge you until you figure out how you're going to pay for it, we'll do that. We have the luxury of being around for a long time and having the resources to do that, and having the partners like AWS to help us do that. And one of those things includes the data piece. And so if you're using our filter Relay to monitor and protect your students, you can at no charge turn on this data piece. And all we're trying to do there is say who's using what, my Zoom or Hangouts or whatever examples you want are there, and we're trying to just give you enough data and insights, not just a giant file full of data, but really actionable graphs and insights and data that you can drive back to the educators and say, a few of my students are not attending online class ever, and it's because they don't have an internet connection, and I didn't know that, and I had no way to know that. Or they're not using the LMS because the instructor in charge of their class hasn't had the professional development and has chosen just to get all the faces on the screen and try to work through the problems with their Google Docs or Office 365 experience. And so you think about what we're seeing is maybe G Suite and 365 are kind of my LMS today, and I'm moving towards an LMS, but I don't know what my adoption rate is, who has adopted when they haven't, and how that works. And so as much as it's about which students are using which applications and where's the device and are they safe, it's also about, we didn't have time to do PD. All the educators that are responsible for this are just making sure everyone's face is on the screen and that my sixth grader isn't multitasking with Fortnite. Those are kind of some just basic things we're trying to provide to the customer as soon as possible. And then we understand that may mean that they implement some change or buy some software or applications they weren't using before, or understand they had duplicate applications running. And that's only a problem because the continuity that we talk about across all of the students, like, well, for this class I use this particular platform, and for the other class I use that one, and that's confusing. And so I think it's just visibility. We're not the only ones who could provide that, but but I think it's a really useful thing right now.
Well, and that visibility hits on a topic that we haven't addressed, but I know came in a lot of questions, which is about how you make sure student data privacy isn't at risk, how you make sure that teachers aren't responding to all of these free offers for software that they're seeing in their Facebook stream and doing something that puts your students at risk. So, I mean, you're talking about the visibility into that, right? Being able to provide that so you know that you're using the right tools, keeping students safe. But it also probably comes to the PD, like you talked about, and a lot of questions came in on that. Tina and Pete, could you talk about just what you're looking at for professional development, training teachers, not just on how to teach remotely, but how to use the right tools, or the tools that have been vetted, or those sorts of things?
So I have an instructional technology team, and they've really blossomed during this because they're holding webinars at all hours, and they're getting hundreds of teachers on these webinars on various topics, whether it's Google Classroom or Microsoft Teams, and some of the various district-based applications. But it's almost a time that they've shined, because it's a department sometimes that people are like, what do they actually do, right? So unless it's one of those more progressive teachers that are attending, we've been offering these for years, and you've got those, as Pete mentioned, you got 150 or so of those that are ready, and then the rest not. And so I think we're bringing on some of those. I kind of like to talk sometimes about, you got your speedboats, you got your little tugboats, and then you got your anchors. And usually, your speedboats are going to pull the tugboats, and hopefully the anchors come up a little bit. But this has kind of accelerated that. And so we've done a ton of webinars. We're taping the webinars. They're doing question answer sessions at various hours. So they've done a lot of that, and we're getting ready to move into, what are we doing in the summer? What are we offering in the summer? And as Pete mentioned, a lot of it's going to be voluntary. We're not going to have enough funding to pay every teacher to attend. But I think in the grand scheme of things, you're going to get a lot of those teachers that recognize that they need some skill development. And so I think they're probably going to invest some of their time this summer, because it's going to make their life easier in the fall. Because again, it's probably, my personal opinion is probably going to be some form of blended, so we're going to have some form of this. It may not be as exaggerated, but they're still going to have to learn to manage in these environments. And and some of the questions we don't know is, are some of the parents going to send their kids back to school? We don't know what that looks like right now. So even if we open schools, are they going to come back? And so, and there are, alternate choices out there that, Florida Virtual has been a big platform for many, many years. So that's, some of the questions that we're asking, but certainly the professional development and gearing up for that over these next 3 months is a huge piece that we're working on.
Yep.
Yeah, for us, I'm also very blessed by having a phenomenally learning team. I've got members of that team that are nationally recognized. One of them has a book coming out this month on blended learning, so they are top flight people that really know this material well. But trying to disseminate that out to the entire staff is always the challenge, because there has to be purpose, a why behind it. Well, now the why has presented itself in a very obvious way. And so and also, thankfully, we have a culture of professional learning. In your first 2 years in Wayne Township, you have to take 30 hours of professional development, or you get a pink slip at the end of those 2 years. And we pink slip people every year about this time because they didn't take the classes. So there's a real sense of like, hey, we have to do better every year. Everything's always changing. And so this is a significant disruptive change, but it's still change, and we're going to get professional development for it. Thankfully, as a part of that, we've really standardized in terms of how you get into all of our digital tools. We've tried to use interoperability to put those tools inside of our learning management. We have a single learning management tool. We've standardized on, our collaboration tools are all in Google, and then, all the adoptions we're doing digitally, we're creating easy ways for people to get to them. So thankfully, we've created a structure over the last 15 or 20 years that makes it easier to do the teaching. I really feel terrible for those schools that have all of these different places their students and staff need to go to get access. If that's their situation, that's their biggest problem they have to solve, because if it's not easy, students and staff will have a really hard time. I don't care how much professional development you do to get into those resources. So the first thing is keep the ramp low. And then the second thing is, with the professional development you still need to do, keep it concise. We use a lot of professional learning communities so that people can choose their own path and then kind of just get the help they need, as opposed to show up at this training. That's our approach.
So I hear this a lot about the standardized consistency, keep it simple. One of the main things I hear it with is the LMS. Pick one, or at least one for middle and high school and a different one for elementary, and train all teachers to use it the same way. Just adding this consistency so that parents and students don't have to deal with a completely different thing for every class that they're going to, right?
Everyone I talk to that does my job across the country, and when we talk about help desk tickets, guess what all the questions are? The ones from parents are, why are you making this so complicated for my children? You're having them go to 20 different places in the course of a day, and they can't keep up. simplify. And sir, the other thing is obviously login IDs. I need my what's my login ID for this specific digital tool? But you can eliminate all that if you keep it simple.
And Amy, I'd be remiss if I didn't jump in on the privacy issue, because
Yeah.
CoSN's done a lot of work on privacy, and this might be a time when school leaders say, well, we're just too busy for that, but I think it's quite the opposite. With students and teachers working from home, all the more important to be very tight on understanding privacy. And I would direct people to trustedlearning.org. We've over the last 4 years worked to identify 25 key practices that every school system should be doing. Now, this includes things that you legally have to do, but it also is just best practice. So there are certain things that are policy related that your school board should be adopting. There are certain things that relate to the technology around cybersecurity and protection of that data. The hardest part is probably around the teaching and learning and the professional development for teachers. Please go there, even if you can't reach all 25, you should start on a continuous improvement plan to see, well, okay, we're doing 15 of these 25. There's another 5 we can do that are low-hanging fruit, and then have a plan for how we get to the last 5. And when you get to all 25, you achieve the seal of a trusted learning environment.
Keith, you mentioned at the beginning that this might seem like, a time when things are different. We don't have to worry about that, right? But I think the key point that you make, in addition to needing to focus on student data privacy, is that this is still school. It looks different, but we still need to be educating students, keeping them safe, reporting on what they're doing, providing some accountability, doing all those things that school is. It's just in a really different way.
We do, and it has to be done in a safe and secure network. And cybersecurity isn't a nice to have; it's a must have. And that's even we're seeing, all kinds of phishing attacks are just dramatically off the charts as we move into a home environment. That students and teachers are distracted, and they're even just the same phishing attacks that were happening at school that 2% of, according to the cybersecurity places, 2% of teachers would click on them. Well, now it's like 20%. I mean, it's gone through the roof, and there's all kinds of new scams. And so we need to get serious about this, and we need to invest in really good cybersecurity also.
Well, and I think that hackers are pretty smart about figuring out how to prey on people's anxiety and the emotions that they're feeling right now to get them to click something that 3 months ago they would have just ignored, right? Tina, you're nodding emphatically.
Yeah, because as Keith said, we've seen an uptick. I mean, I'll be watching email and all of a sudden Office 365 alert, and somebody clicked on something. Luckily I have an operation team that remediate those quickly, but we're definitely seeing an increase in that.
Just to really drive home to the whole audience, what's at risk there? Why do schools really need to be thinking about security, student data privacy? What could be the implications?
Absolutely, student records hold a lot of private confidential information, and then just the safety and well-being of students and teachers. They're using now home networks, so the home devices, home Wi-Fi. I mean, there's a whole bunch of new challenges. As bleak as it was around the at-school network in terms of cybersecurity, it's even more problematic than the last 8 weeks.
Yeah, there's a technical answer to this, these things that are PII, but the real answer is trust. What's at stake is trust. Your trust with your community, if it's broken because there's been a vulnerability exposed, good night. right? I mean, there's a lot of institutions that will tell
You're in
you
the news, right?
in millions and billions how much they have lost because
Yeah.
they've lost trust. As school districts, we don't lose millions and billions, but trust is a very difficult thing to rebuild.
Yeah.
So as we're coming up towards the end of our 90 minutes, it has really flown by. I want to give all of our panelists an opportunity to share the one takeaway, one piece of advice they'd like our many hundreds of people who are listening to walk away with, whether it's something that worked really well for you, that you just want schools to be thinking about, something you wish you knew 3 months ago that you know now. That let's start with you, Chad.
Yeah, so I mean, first, I just want to say, thanks to the school technology leaders for what you're doing. I mean, as somebody that's worn that hat before, and just watching online from afar, it's amazing work, and I can't even imagine what you're going through. I mean, I think my advice is, I encourage you to use this time to rethink and maybe look outside of K12 to see how you could do something differently. I feel like a lot of times, as I've spent some time in the private sector now, we still tend to stay in that silo, and I think this is a time where there could be a lot of reinvention. And I'm really encouraged by the schools that we've been able to collaborate over the last couple months, because we've done some really creative and reinventive things. So that's where I encourage you to be, and we're glad to help out there.
Tina, how about you?
For me, I've been doing a lot of work around, student devices and whatnot. And, we've got lots of evidence where you can implement, you can build it. And my question has always been, how do we sustain it, right? And so my hope out of this is that legislators and even some leaders who maybe not in the technology realm and don't understand the criticalness, I think even at some superintendent levels, what we need to invest and rethink about budgeting. Because I don't think it's going to take a ton of money. I think it's rethinking what and how we budget. But the sustainability piece is critical, because you build this environment and you provide all this training, but you have to refresh those devices. We all know technology is changing so rapidly. So for me, I hope we'll get some sort of sustained funding and possibly E-rate. I know CoSN worked very, very heavily on this, and I know that we've made, as Keith said, we've definitely made inroads, but the digital divide is something that we've got to tackle, and the only way to tackle that is to be equitable. I mean, we don't ever think about what we invest in textbooks. I mean, this has always been a struggle for me, is we invest millions of dollars and nobody's asking us about what research has been done to say that this textbook make any difference on AP Calc or biology. But we invest all this money. There's an amazing amount of content and really free, good content resources out there. So part of it is about really getting at a cabinet level, everybody on that same page, understanding the budgeting and what this new normal, as you said, what does this new normal look like? So I'd like to see us be able to really make that second order change and look at, it's time to give every kid a device. There's no real question about, is it the right thing and when it's going to happen. It's here. And this is our opportunity, but we really need from the federal to the state to local legislators to understand what it's going to take for us to do that. So that's what I hope comes out of this.
Yeah, and I think a really important point here is that when schools first shut down, they might have thought, we just need to get through 2 weeks, 2 months, just to the end of the year, right? In that sort of situation, maybe you can just hack together the best thing that works. But now we need to be thinking really long term for the fall, for 2020, 2021 school year, and then just for the future, right? Pick the right things, do the right things that you want to and can sustain for this long-term shift that you're talking about. Keith, what are your words of wisdom?
Well, I think it is that moment to lean into, the moment. And this is not a time to roll back to what we had, but think about what we should have. And I think building on what Tina was saying about, getting a device for every student, we need to make sure that at home students have access. And this isn't, we think in our lane of education, but the same families that are disconnected uh, for learning are disconnected for medical care. They're disconnected for finding a job. And so I think we need to link arms and talk about what home access means and find allies that find those, in the medical world to say, the same families that are disconnected are the ones with diabetes management, with, and we see this in other places in the world. We took a delegation 10 years ago to Uruguay. The president of Uruguay it's a very poor country generally, and they decided that the way to ensure equity was to provide a device and connectivity to every family. And yeah, it's used by students during the day, but when they go to the bed, nutrition programs are offered for the mothers, to learn about how to cook nutrition. And I think we have a tendency to silo everything in the United States because that's the way funding happens. But we need to say to our policymakers, we need to fix and get broadband to every family everywhere. And that includes underserved and rural.
Thanks, Keith. Pete, you're nodding, so I imagine you're going to build on that.
Yeah, we've talked a lot about disruption on this call, right? And, I first really started hearing a lot about that idea in education through Michael Horn, the Christensen Institute, many years ago. And kind of this idea of disruption really kind of brings us to the question of like, hey, how can your district, what can your district be if it could be anything? How could it best serve students if it could do anything? And thinking outside of the box there, because we have this disruptor right now that's making us create a reset. So I think my word of wisdom is think about that. Don't feel like you need to change everything with all of your systems because you don't have time for that. You've got a couple of months to get ready. So look at what's working, look at, scale that up, make that stronger, and then look at where your failure is happening and do some adoptions to fix the failure. So that would be kind of my combined sets of wisdom to people that are thinking through this right now.
How about you, Brian? What's one thing you'd want schools to be thinking?
Yeah, a really simple thing for me is that, every day I receive dozens or more email solicitations and I read COVID in the subject and then delete. So Lightspeed's careful not to put COVID in our subject line. What I'm saying is trust the vendors that you know. There is just a lot of really hardworking K12 specific, super dedicated people in the vendor community who may seem like at this point are being opportunistic or trying to exploit schools and their need right now. But most of them are really just trying to help you and have the expertise to help you and are willing to make exceptions to make it all work for you, because we know we're going to be working together we've been working together the last 20 years, but we'll be working together for another 20 years. And we both benefit from that relationship. So I would say, if at all possible, trust the vendors that you know and tell them exactly what you're trying to accomplish. We go from complicated RFPs and competitive situations, from how am I going to do all of this with, from your hardware providers to your manufacturers to your, connectivity people, all the way down to little software companies like Lightspeed. But we're really willing to adjust, and we need your advice on what to do from product development to support to how we should most help you. So, the advice is to trust the ones you know.
Yeah, I'll kind of close with that thought here too. As the sender of most of those emails on behalf of Lightspeed Systems, I think that for me, it really hit a situation where it was like, wow, the thing every single school district is dealing with and needs around the world is something we provide. Can we help them? So emailing that to get that message out there, and as Brian mentioned earlier, offering these solutions for free, and we're really glad that Tina took advantage of that offer and that Pete has been using these solutions. So in closing here, I want to thank all of our panelists for believing in us. I want to thank all of our attendees for opening and reading that email and registering for this discussion and trusting us as Lightspeed Systems and me. When this webinar ends and you leave, you're going to get a quick survey. It's 3 little tiny questions. I appreciate you filling that out because it will help all of us give you more of the kind of content you want and deliver the solutions that you want. So I always like to make sure I end a little bit early with these things. You have time to go get ready for your next meeting. We answered a lot of the questions that came through just through the discussion as I was throwing them out, but there are hundreds in there. So we'll follow up on any of those specific questions, those things we can help you out with. And the blueprint for returning to school and the roadmap, those things that various speakers mentioned and I see lots of questions about, I'll go edit the follow-up email that you're going to get with the recording to this and make sure that those are in there so that you have access to those. So in closing, thank you all very much. Thank you, Keith and Pete and Tina and Chad and Brian, for sharing your experience and insight, and thank you to our attendees.
Thank you, Amy, for keeping us on track.
Bye.
Thanks, everybody.
Good job, Amy. Good job, everyone.
Bye, everybody.